Okay, so this is just who I am. You already know who I am. I'm a member of the Santa Barbara Lodge. And the whole question is, how could somebody be a Christian philosopher or theologian? But since philosophy is the love of wisdom or knowledge of the soul, I think it's all right to call Origen a philosopher. So I'm going to do that. And okay, here is a statue of Origen, and frankly, many of these Christian fathers look alike. They're all older men in robes with long white beards and looking wise. So Origen uh, was born in Alexandria, and his name Origanus apparently was a rather common name. It's also Egyptian. It means a son or aspect of Horus, the Egyptian god, and it's possible that there was more than one Origen in the Neoplatonic school, judging from what Porphyry says, because he talks about a pagan origin and a Christian origin, and he doesn't like the Christian origin too much. But I like the Christian origin, and I will show you why. And I think he's very important in the history of philosophy and theology, and that's why I'm very glad to discuss him today. Okay, so he was born it's actually 184 or 185 to a Christian family. And he's also called Origanus Adamantius. Incidentally, in the Greek, his name begins with omega. And it's probably not too significant, but I always thought it was Omicron. But that's where we get the Origanus. And his father taught him Greek literature and the texts of Hebrew Christian canon extant at the time. And his father was martyred at the persecution of Septimus Severus, who was one of the cruelest Roman emperors. And it's said that Origen, although only about 17, wanted to go into martyrdom with his father, but that the mother prevented him. She took all his clothes away so he couldn't leave the house without being indecent. So he didn't get martyred with his father, fortunately. Now this is controversial. He is said to take Matthew 19:4 so literally that he had himself physically castrated by a physician, um, because theologically he thought that there were literal, moral, and mystical interpretations of scripture, although he wasn't always literal. So this has generally been disputed because it's a pretty radical thing to do. That must have been an ouch for a guy. That's all I can say. But he also is said to wanted to teach women and did not want any gossip about this because this was an unusual thing to do in those days. Now he studied with Ammonius Saccas, and this is very important because he was the teacher of Plotinus, who is probably the most well-known of what my church teacher Berger Pearson at UC Santa Barbara called a middle Platonism. That is those Platonists that were in the early first centuries, and really kept the teachings of Plato alive, but also did their own thing. And of course, Plotinus is very famous for his discourses called the Enneads about the soul. And he's mentioned three times by Porphyry, but it may very well be that there was more than one Origen in the school, because there's an Origen Porphyry likes and an Origen that Porphyry does not like. It might be that he liked the Christian, he disliked the Christian side of Origen and liked the Christian side, or that there were two of them, and it's never been clear in all that I've read. Now, he's also a student of Clement of Alexandria, who was the head of the Catechumenical Christian School of Alexandria. I didn't type that out because I never spell it correctly, but in Catholicism, a catechumen is one who's studying to be possibly a Catholic. But don't confuse this with Clement of Rome, who was a pope and was sainted, because Clement of Alexandria was known as a Gnostic, and he said the actual birth of Jesus of Nazareth was November 17th, which is interesting because it's also the day Krishna is said to have died. And so, if that adept was born again, he might have been born on that date. We really don't know. But Clement of Alexandria is considered a heretic, and so is Origen. But he was initiated into the mystery schools of Neoplatonism. This is pretty clear. Now, the question would be, how would someone who is so very Christian as Origen was going to be also a Neoplatonist and even initiated into the mystery school? Well, I would say this about the Alexandrian library. Here's a picture of what it might have looked like with all its different skulls, is that although there was a doxa, there's a teaching in Neoplatonism, it is not dogmatic. And remember, in Plato wrote 36 dialogues, and quite a number of them don't come to any conclusion, like this is the truth and you better believe it. And it's left very open-ended, like Theaetetus, what is knowledge? It's very open-ended as to what knowledge is when that dialogue finishes, or what justice is in the Republic, for example. So I have no doubt that if someone were morally and intellectually worthy of initiation and presented themselves to the teacher of the school, Ammonius Saccas, that they would be admitted. And actually, it's a very good thing for Western civilization, and because Christianity became the dominant religion in that civilization, that later on, when Renaissance Platonism arose, there was already a tradition of Neoplatonism in Christianity, which is continued with St. Augustine, of course, and it was very influential because Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. So this is just, again, a painting representation of what the Alexandrian library might have looked like. Inside, it was clearly a place of discourse and argument and disagreement. I mean, they didn't kill each other over disagreements, they debated. And that was very important because Origen did a lot of debating, and apparently he was very, very brilliant at debate. Okay, so something about his life. He traveled to Caesarea in Palestine, Jordan, Antioch, Greece, and Rome, where he debated Valentinus of Rome, who was a Gnostic. And of course, Valentinus is very famous for his teaching of the God beyond God, which Origen disagreed with. He thought God was the ultimate intellective principle. But he did debate the Gnostics, although he had Gnostic tendencies himself, especially his view of the pre-existence of the soul, which the Gnostics, all different types of them, held to be true, from the libertine to the very ascetic ones. So he taught Christianity to a dowager empress in Antioch, it said, and he was ordained a priest in Caesarea because of his learning and very impressive teaching. But Bishop Demetrius of Alexandria protested his ordination and defrocked him. So even in the very early church, you get the late second, early third century, there was all this stuff going on when you didn't even have a Catholic church. You didn't even have a fully formed Christian canon at that time. That the Christian canon wasn't formed until the Council of Nicaea at 325 before the Common Era. But he was welcomed back to Caesarea as a priest and opened a school. And Demetrius died, that bishop in Alexandria, so he was considered a priest, and he did a lot of debating. He debated Celsus, who was a materialist and a strong philosophical opponent of Christianity. There's a treatise called Contra Celsum, the disapproval of materialistic teachings. Say, so his wait a minute, I got to go one back. Oh no, here we go. Okay. Yeah. Um, well, his students in Caesarea included, and I seem to be, this is very, very sensitive. Okay. It included church leaders Theochristus and Ambrose, who was later sated, and sorry for the typo, traveled and taught in eastern part of the Roman Empire. And during the persecution of Decius, he was imprisoned and tortured. Tough guy. He didn't die, but it broke his health, and he died in 254 after the Common Era. So he led a very noble life. He had many writings, but the only ones that really survive are Contra Celsum and the De Principiis, which was translated into Latin by a scholar named Rufinus, and also St. Jerome, who didn't like him, but Jerome wanted to show why he didn't like him. Okay, so there's the Contra Celsum, and some of the Latin is very convoluted and difficult. So the way it's written in English is difficult. Uh, in this book, chapter 32, it's not more. Is it not more in conformity with reason that every soul, for certain mysterious reasons, I speak now according to the opinion of Pythagoras and Plato and Empedocles, whom Celsus frequently named, is introduced into a body and introduced according to his deserts and former actions. It is probable, therefore, that the soul which conferred more benefit by former residence in the flesh than that of many men, to avoid prejudice, do not say all, stood in need of a body not superior to others, but invested with all excellent qualities. Now, this is from a Latin translation, and I'm quoting here Head and Cranston, who did a great deal of research, the Phoenix Fire Mystery, and I think wrote, well, Sylvia Cranston, the alias of Anita Atkins, I think wrote about 6 books on reincarnation, including Reincarnation and World Thought. And she was a great theosophist in New York. Okay, now from the first principles, De Principiis, and again, this is, highly convoluted language. There had been a descent from a high to a lower condition on part not only of souls who have deserved the change by variety of their movements, but also on those who, in order to serve the whole world, were brought down from those higher and invisible spheres to those lower and invisible ones. As to those souls which, on account of their excessive mental defects, stood in need of bodies of a gross nature, this visible world was called into being. So it sounds like he does have the idea of the descent of the Dionys, or the gods, or the higher beings into bodies, and their pre-existence in this particular phrase in the first principles. Now, one thing that Porphyry probably disliked him for is that he didn't make the first principle of reality the one that the Tohain, beyond all intellect, as Plotinus did, but the supreme intellect and primary being. And later on, this had an influence on scholasticism um, in the arguments that were presented, like in the 9th and 10th century, that of Saint Anselm, that than which nothing greater can be conceived or thought. That's God. To Origen, the highest intellect of being. And in the ontological argument, if you have that idea in your mind and then say it does not exist, then you're contradicting yourself, because then you're making it that which is the greatest lesser. And so this has been argued about for years, is actually thought to beg the question, and I think it does, as it assumes what it's trying to prove. But it's a very interesting argument. Now he really takes from St. Paul, uh, in the first Corinthians 15, the idea of a tripartite soul, but also the body, of course, is simply a composite. So it's really not the soul, but the soul is pneuma, the gift of God, the spirit, the nous, the upper soul, suke, the incorporeal seat of the will and personality. We do have free will. It's very important. And then to sarkos in Greek, which is just, really the soul holds the body together, no soul, dead body. So he's very much like St. Paul in this, that he doesn't want to talk about resurrection of a physical body, which of course St. Jerome and some later Christians did not like. Okay, so let's go to the Trinity. There were wars fought over the idea of the Trinity and the Eucharist. Of course, there were always economic reasons involved, but for the purposes of this, Jesus is the incarnate Word, the Logos. Now, of course, the John 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, in arche kai ho logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And this is extremely important for Origen. And humans are in the image of God, but Jesus is the perfected Son of God. Although he doesn't talk about him being the only begotten Son of God, but he does say that the transfiguration of the Christ means the attaining the highest knowledge of the forms beyond this world. Again, you have Neoplatonism, the aesthetic forms, which are essentially values like justice, for example, and virtue, and arete or excellence, and then mathematical forms. So the Christ being born in the soul is the ascension, and the soul is the bride of Christ. In the Song of Songs, which of course is in the Hebrew Bible, it said that Origen studied Hebrew in order to read that Bible in the original. And of course, if you pick up a Hebrew Bible, you'll find out that the Christians actually rearranged the Bible to end with Micah, so that everything points to the coming of the Christ. Whereas in the Hebrew Bible, it's Torah, law, Nevim, prophets, Ketuvim, writings. And so it does mention the Messiah in Isaiah. And Isaiah actually says, an Alma, a young woman, shall conceive and bear a son. He doesn't say that the young woman has to be a virgin, but St. Matthew translates Alma as Parthenos, which meant virgin, such as Athena was Parthenos. That's what they call the Parthenon, in honor of her, the Parthenon. But Parthenos also meant a woman who lived independently. So you're not sure what this means, but Alma would be the word for virgin in Hebrew. And it also has to do with the purity of the being incarnated. And this is important. And actually, there are only two of the synoptic gospels, Matthew and Luke, that discuss the virgin birth. Mark does not, and Mark doesn't even discuss the resurrection. John doesn't discuss the virgin birth, but starts out with a highly metaphysical idea, and then the word becomes flesh and dwelled among us, and then it goes into the life of Jesus in a somewhat different sequential way than the synoptic gospels. It seems that Origen is very devoted to John and Paul's work. Okay, so we'll finish this. So if we look at a comparison between the hypostases of being, you see the Christian hypothesis, you have Father, And then you have Tohain in the Neoplatonic view strictly, although it would be the intellective principle with Origen. And then the son, Dunamis or Logos, Origen agreed with that. And Logos is pure dynamic principle. Again, sorry, a typo. I thought I got it out of there. And then the Holy Spirit active in all who elect it by free will. And then nous consciousness wells up as I am I. So again, this reminds us very much of the three fundamentals of theosophy. And of course, the Neoplatonists really carried that torch in the Western world. I mean, Theosophia comes from, it's thought to be Ammonius Saccas, and there was a previous teacher, Apollonius of Tyana, who is said to have paranormal powers, who lived a couple of hundred years before um, Ammonius Saccas and Plotinus and such, who had these teachings as well. Okay, so Origen got anathematized. Is said in the Council of Constantinople convened in May 1553 to condemn reincarnation in spite of the protests of Pope Vigilius. I don't know, I knocked out these errors and yet they're still here. I guess I didn't save it in time. But this is an important point. The Catholic bishops did not attend this council where Origen and especially the pernicious doctrine of the pre-existence of souls got anathematized, which is very important because I've always said to Catholic friends who believe in reincarnation, and I know quite a few who do, I say you may, although it's not a doctrine of your church, it wasn't condemned. It was condemned by Orthodox bishops, but then in some sense, why should anyone be bound by these councils of these old fuddy-duds? But they actually wrote, if anyone assert the fabulous pre-existence of souls and the monstrous restoration which follows from it, let him be anathema. And this is really bad. It's wham, bam, you're going to hell. If any of you ever saw the movie with Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole, when Richard Burton is the Archbishop of Canterbury excommunicates someone, it's pretty mean. It means you've had it. So if anyone does an anathematized Arius, and he was a monk who I think said the son wasn't consubstantial with the father. Isn't that terrible? And Nestorius, who had more or less the idea of Jesus being a prophet, which is interesting because Muhammad's uncle was an Nestorian monk, and he said Isha Jesus was a prophet, and Origen, as well as their impious writings, and all of this condemned by the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Let him be anathema. So wham, bam, you're going to hell if you believe that. That's pretty bad. Okay, so what are the teachings of Origen? Let's get a little more cheerful. Okay, he said, and I think these are very free translations from Greek and Latin, which is very convoluted in style. You yourself are even another world, have within you the sun, the moon, and all the stars, and also the stars. The human heart is not a small thing, for it embraces so much. And what good does it do if Christ was born in Bethlehem once, if he is not born again in the heart through faith? Now, again, this is almost out of Paul's Galatians, in which he says to the Galatians, I shall not rest till Christ be born in you. And Elaine Pagel's colleague at Princeton, now retired, makes a very good case that Paul was actually a Gnostic. He had hundreds of letters, 16 were preserved by the church, and also it's said to be expunged of Gnosticism, interpolated, but not entirely expunged, because there are Gnostic ideas in Paul, in Colossians and Galatians, such as that the Christos is going to be really in you, a part of you, that Jesus is the great guide. uh, but not um, necessarily he alone can attain to the state of the Christos. Okay, so another, this is a translation from De Principia. If it can be shown that an incorporeal and reasonable being has life independently of the body, and that it is worse off than the body, then out of it, then without a doubt, bodies and are of only of secondary importance and arise from time to time and meet the varying conditions of reasonable creatures. Those who require bodies are clothed with them, and contrariwise, when fallen souls have lifted themselves up better things, their bodies are once more annihilated. Thus, they are vanishing and ever reappearing. And this is translated from Jerome's epistle to Octavius, which is around 410 of the Common Era. And Jerome opposed Origen's teaching and also metempsychosis. And Saint Jerome wrote a long diatribe against Origen, saying that the idea of metempsychosis was really so awful because one, heaven forbid, might even be reborn as a woman, something that lowly, and could be a prostitute, which of course Mary Magdalene was, but he just seems to ignore that and regards Origen with a great deal of contempt as a heretic. And yet he does translate him, I guess, in order to refute him. So I think that's another important evidence that Origen did definitely hold the idea of pre-existence of the soul, which, given some of the things that are said even in the canonical gospels, like Jesus is asked, "Art thou Elijah who is for to come?" In Matthew, and Jesus says that Elijah already has come. He was speaking of John the Baptist. So let's see. I think that there's another slide which I wanted. Where is it? I go over to play again. Yeah. No, I'm back to square one. Let's just go through this. It's a little review here.
The little review.
Yeah. If all of you are capable of reading that fast. Okay. Well, I just don't know what happened to that. There was another slide with some of the teachings of Origen, but I it doesn't seem to be on this one. Um, and I don't know why. But Origen clearly uh, does think that souls pre-existed the body, and even as the flyer said that it's very clear that he also has a very cosmic idea where you yourself are even another little world and have within you the sun and the moon and also the stars. The idea that the soul is really limitless, or of course the body is simply a temporary composite. That's direct Platonism. Uh, he says the human heart is no small thing, for it can embrace so much. So, and I think it's a very free translation. I think Truth will disagree with me about this, that he said every soul comes into the world strengthened by the victories or weakened by the defeats of a previous life. And he says its place in the world as a vessel appointed to honor or dishonor is determined by its place in the world and is determined by its previous merits or demerits. Its work in the world determines its place of the world to follow this. So it's clear that he thought there was a literal, uh, a a moral and a mystical meaning to the scripture. And it's also clear that although there was no Christian canon at the time, that he took scripture pretty seriously as to what they clearly had. The Gospels, um, which were written, Luke and Matthew were written about 80 of the Common Era. Mark was written about 70. And it also has Jesus say that the temple will be burned down, and which it was in 70 of the Common Era. And John was written about 90 to 105 of the Common Era, and which is not synoptical. And of course, the Christian canon had not been at all solidified yet. And according to Walter Bauer, a German scholar, in Orthodoxy and Heresy and earliest Christianity, this was not clear at all, because there were more Gnostics, Bauer thinks, in the 2nd century of the Common Era than there were what later became Catholic or Orthodox Christianity, which began to rise in the 3rd century. And it's clear that our friend Origen has a very Orthodox tone to him, but he's also Neoplatonist, and so was St. Augustine. And as I said, what I think is important about this, however, is that if you keep Neoplatonism in Christianity in the Western world, as very destructive as the different Christian sects became, when it came around for the time of the Florentine Academy, at least there was in place a teaching in the Christian church of Origen and of Neoplatonism. And so Pico della Mirandola, who really was important in developing Renaissance and Neoplatonism, studied with some of the Muslim scholars, and also Rabbi Elijah de Medigo of Crete, who was a Kabbalist. And so I think it's important that Origen tradition was kept underground. There's no doubt that his books were burned and he was anathematized and all that. But I can see why the Neoplatonists would let him in, because he was, again, morally worthy, intellectually capable, although perhaps never became a master of the situation as did Plotinus. But obviously very tough and powerful and brilliant thinker. So very worth remembering. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about him. And let's see, how do I get rid of all the slides now? Let's just talk about this. You must have some comments or questions. Or
yeah, you must. Isn't there an unshare thing or down at the bottom?
Okay. Okay. I don't know where. Oh no, it says stop shares at the top.
That's
Yeah,
the
here
one.
we go.
That's okay.
Here we go. Yeah, we can get rid of that. I can go back and show you any slide that you want to see again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judy.
Okay, somebody has raised their hand. So
Hey, Luca.
no, Luca. Okay.
She's gonna
Hey,
unmute.
Luca.
Oh, hi, good afternoon, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you so much. It was really wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, okay. I just say thank you very much. It was a beautiful presentation and research. I was wondering if you can speak a little more about the fact that, as I understood when I did at Utah, a presentation a long time ago, that I was searching him as well, the part in which they were start killing a lot of the priests because of they want to force him to remove the doctrine of the pre-existing of the soul from the original writings. and then he refused to do it. And then what they did is start killing other priests to force him. And then he finally signed out and agreed to that. Can you talk more about that?
I'm not sure I heard everything you said. Are you speaking of Origen?
Hello?
Oh, who agreed to that? I didn't hear.
Yes, Origen. That he was was in the third. I just want to put my other mic. In the third century.
Where did you read that?
Century. Apparently, I think it was Constantine, the one
Well,
that
I know.
was. It was when I did my research. I remember reading it. Yeah, I did. I searched many different books. I know HPB talks about it as well, about him. He is mentioned, and that he was actually forced to remove the pre-existing doctrine at the third era from the original writings that they were teaching at the time, the Christian writings.
Well, of course, they all didn't get removed because De Principiis survives. And I know he was tortured by order of a Roman emperor, and his health was broken. So it might have been like Galileo is said to have recanted because he didn't think he could face the worst forms of the Inquisition. But I haven't read that particular part. I know, I think it's in Isis Unveiled that he's mentioned. And he might have, in broken health and in great duress, done something to that effect, but his writings do survive. And Jerome just goes after him in a very nasty way. But, there is a whole strain of history of the alternative reality in the West. There's actually a book about it by Robert Elwood, who's a theosophist in Crotona, that talks about how all this teaching of pre-existence of the soul and the eternality of the soul post-existence survives in the West in spite of the attempts to destroy it. So I don't think I can answer your question any better than your research might have gone beyond what I've been able to do. So do you have a particular quotation from HPB?
No, thank you. No, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for
Yes,
your question.
it's
Can you take a question from
I
Jeff?
researched what maybe I will bring it up later. Yeah, I thank you very much for your answer.
Jeffrey has his hand up. Clark.
Oh, hi, Jeffrey.
Hi, Judy. Yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed it. I'm a devotee of Origen. I just love his writings, including his homilies. He did the homilies on Leviticus, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And, as you know, if you start to read the Bible, Leviticus is often where you kind of get bogged down.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, the people get stoned to death for breaking the Sabbath and that kind of thing. Yes, not very
Right.
nice. Yeah.
And so Origen brings it to life. That's what he does with the entire Bible. That's what is so wonderful about his writings. But on this topic of pre-existence, I wanted to just chime in. I think definitely, you can't. It's clear from what, like Origen says, everybody except Jesus, the Son of God, can either rise or fall. He says angels as well as human beings can do that. And if you look at the context, which you brought up early in your talk,
Mm-hmm.
You have to have some form of rebirth in order for that process to even take place. it doesn't make sense. And also, as for pre-existence, Augustine went back and forth on pre-existence.
Yes, according to the Sylvia Cranston's research, he did. And he even goes back and forth in the confessions about whether he's going to be Christian or not, or whether he's going to keep womanizing and having a great time stealing peaches and such and other sinful. Oh Lord, make me pure, but not justly yet. I think he says. So Origen is really much more strict about the whole thing from the very beginning as a teenager.
Well, as you said, Judy, Origen's a philosopher. As Nietzsche quipped, Augustine is a rhetorician. He taught rhetorics, and he doesn't have that sort of philosophical gravitas that somebody like Origen.
Well, he was a Neoplatonist. I mean, Augustine at least does go into Plato and uses that as a model for his city of God, but I think he is less on a high philosophical level than Origen. I would agree.
Yeah, and so what I want just your opinion about is why would okay, and even Jerome when he was young followed Origen, and then he saw kind of which side of the bread his butter was on, and ended up attacking his former guide. But as a whole, why isn't Origen better known? And first of all, why would he's like the greatest philosophical mind, after Paul in the Christian tradition, as far as I can see. I mean,
yes.
And why wouldn't he? And he appears in interesting places like Saint Bernard, in writing his commentary on the Song of Songs. Obviously, he'd read Origen. It's just sort of an echo of what Origen had been writing. So, what do you think? Why? How can they reject somebody who is really the person who got the ball rolling for a high level of philosophy?
Well, yes, but I mean, popular Christianity was not on a high level of philosophy. I mean, if you believe in reincarnation, I mean, how are you going to have power over that soul? But if you teach people that there's one life, and if you don't believe this, you're damn well going to go to hell, then this scares a lot of people. And I think that the politicization of Christianity in the shadow of the 3rd century, there's a book about it. And then, of course, the Council of Nicaea, which threw out all the Gnostic texts. It said that mysteriously at night they couldn't agree. The bishops couldn't agree on what would be canonical and what would not be. That they'd put all the books on the altar, and that God would remove those that weren't wanted. Well, of course, somebody went in and removed most of the Gnostic texts, and they didn't expunge all the Gnosticism from Paul, however, and they did rearrange the Hebrew Bible, of course, which the Jews didn't like at all. But I think once you have money and power and a theocratic monarchy established, as did the Catholic Church, then you're not going to be able to hold anybody's soul captive if they believe in reincarnation. And so anathematizing Origen meant if his books were preserved, they were probably preserved underground in monasteries. I mean, even there were some Franciscan monks who preserved Lucretius, who's a materialist, but in De Rerum Natura, Lucretius says the universe is infinite, and what can control infinity? And so, the idea of God is just an illusion. And, for Origen, God was the highest intellective principle and had a huge influence again on the whole philosophy of scholasticism that developed. So I think that's why Origen wasn't taught. In some Christian churches today, you can't even mention Origen. I mean, it's just a no-no. It's just like mentioning the devil or something. And it's just not done.
Because in the 20th century, there's been a lot of scholarship, and the Jesuits of all people have done some of the best scholarship on Origen, right?
Yes, and I was amazed when I was studying Gnosticism and Neoplatonism that every time I wanted a book that wasn't at Cal Poly, which isn't a very good liberal arts library, I would go and then the book would come from a Catholic university like Santa Clara.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, the Jesuits have become radicalized, especially in South America, and have championed people's ecological causes and social justice causes very strongly. They've changed immensely, but not totally. Um, but I think it's very clear that once you get anathematized, I mean, in those days when people really believed it, you just don't want to touch that. And considering that most people were illiterate until there were people like Meister Eckhart who met with an accident before he was called to the Inquisition. He's a 14th century German mystic. I mean, he would go out and teach the common people, and this was considered a no-no by the church. Don't talk to the hoi polloi about these philosophical ideas. That Meister Eckhart was a real mystic, and he's been compared to Shankara and others in the Hindu tradition in his mysticism. So I think it was the suppression of Origen, the anathematization, but there clearly some of his books were preserved, as were books of the ancients. But as far as preserving the Alexandrian library, which was burned down several times, the murder of Hypatia, which HPV writes about in 441 of the Common Era, was a horrible incident, and Bishop Cyril of Alexandria, who had only been a Christian for a short time, ordered this mob not only to kill her but to burn the library. Well, it was rebuilt, and in the 7th century, the Muslim general went into Alexandria and had taken over what is now Cairo, and he sent back to the Sultan in Baghdad and said, "What do we do with all these scrolls?" And the Sultan said, well, God, Allah gave us a mind, use it, bring these scrolls back, translate them into Arabic. So that's why in the Crusades, they found out the Muslims knew more about medicine, astronomy, geology, everything, much more than the Christian world did, which was totally ignorant. So the Crusades did help open up the Renaissance because they had medical learning. It's even gotten into Hollywood that they were able to do cures that the Christians had no idea about because they had the ancient Greek medical knowledge. I mean, Saladin sends his physicians to help a Christian knight who's wounded and says, "Oh, Christian knight, we'll take care of that, and then you get out of our country." But they were a lot smarter, and we owe a great deal to Islam about the preservation of ancient learning because of that. They were not as dogmatic.
Wow. Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
I was going to change the subject, but I was going to follow through with kind of the same subject. Is that okay? Okay. So Judy, you mentioned that he was anathematized. Miluka suggested that he might have had to recant. And Jeffrey was saying, how come he's not more studied? My question has to do with the same thing about the pre-existence of the soul, but it's a little bit more, I guess, introspective bent. Because it's apparently you can talk about the after death existence of the soul. That's okay. And you can talk about heaven and life after death. That's not anathema. And when you think about it, in Christianity, you get to be the same person after death as you were before. So really, it's a projection of the personality. And in some ways, theosophically, it's a projection of the personality, at least for the average of 1,500 years that it is, because you still think you are who you were. But this thing about the pre-existence, that's anathema. That's no good. that's more radical. In some ways, they're the same, but in some ways, one of them is more radical than the others. One of them is more earth shaking. And I was wondering if introspectively, you know how Crosby and others say that we need to think of ourselves as take the position of the reincarnating ego. I think that's kind of a direct phrase from Crosby. Take the position of the reincarnating ego. That is an earthquake for the status quo of the personality, because then you're really challenging what the personality is up to, isn't it? Do you see any kind of an anathema kind of a correspondence when the personality may or may not want to take the bigger picture like that?
Yes, if I understand the question, really has to do with the pre-existence of the soul, and it is a shock to the personality to realize. I think all of us have gone through this shock one way or another, that we've always existed in some form. Well, undoubtedly, Origen had this intuition, or he never would have been admitted to the Neoplatonic school and the mysteries behind it, which included theurgy, probably to be able to control the elementals to get to the higher self. Of course, I don't know about theurgy. I've never been to one of their rites. But in Christianity, it's very clear that if you can scare someone into thinking that they're going to have an eternal reward if they simply believe what the priest teaches them and go through the wafer ritual regularly, and if they don't, that they're going to go to hell permanently. And I mean, this, even as Lucretius points out, all of the tortures of hell are simply also those things that we can imagine from what goes on earth, like being burned and that kind of thing. Uh, in Christianity, it's also pointed out by Frederick Copleston, a Jesuit, that if you read the New Testament, and of course the JWs are big on this, they talk about the resurrection of the body in Revelation and a new heaven and a new earth on earth. And they don't really talk so much about heaven and hell. And Copleston, who's a Jesuit priest, says it actually comes from Plato. Really, we're in the Phaedo. Socrates talks about going to the Elysian fields if you've been good, or if you've not been so good, having to go through a kind of purgatorial state. And if you've been really bad, you go to Tartarus and you don't get out, like a tyrant. But Plato, of course, ultimately affirms that we're all going to choose another life in the Republic, and for 1,000 years will fare well. Well, the average person might spend 1,000 or 1,500 years in Devahan, but we know, of course, Theosophists would like to give that up in order to serve. Even in Buddhism, a bodhisattva as well would want to renounce any kind of nirvanic state and return to help. So, I mean, if you really read the whole New Testament, um, you do find this teaching of resurrection of the body, which the Jewish Pharisees held, although the priests of Zadok, the Zadokites, the Sadducees did not. But most of the works about Christianity don't say what they really did hold, but HPB implies that maybe they actually had the keys to the ancient wisdom religion, but just didn't give it out to people because they were so stuffy and wanted to keep it for themselves. So, I, after reading about that, I changed my views that maybe they weren't just materialists after all. And that I think is important to note about Christianity, that this resurrection of the body idea, I mean, it just is absurd to think the physical body could resurrect. Or the Muslims, the so-called Orthodox Muslims, believe that today. But it's clear that St. Paul is talking about the pneuma resurrecting the spirit. He's not talking about the personality, but people want their personality to survive. And people stuck on themselves. And I'm grateful for the teaching of theosophy that I, gave up the little materialism that I ever held. Having been to Berkeley, it was difficult for me for a while.
Truth
I
has
think
his hand up.
Truth wants to tell me where I'm wrong or what right or what.
Hi, Judy. I was just wondering about levels of interpretation because I've read some books about Gnosticism that describe different levels of interpretation, like from the materialistic to the like direct knowledge. And does Origen indicate levels of interpretation? I mean, I think the levels of interpretation, there are 4 classic levels of interpretation up through like the Middle Ages. And then when book publishing came on the scene, it became very polarized between fundamentalism and heresy. Whereas before, when they had a monopoly on the, because no one could read Latin, it kind of gave them a monopoly unless you're educated. That they could have their levels of interpretation, and it was all within their control. Would you say something about levels of interpretation and history and origin?
Yes, the questions about levels of interpretation is stuff like it's called hermeneutic, and if you've been to grad school in religion or a seminary, you have to go through this agony. And for the Jews, there are what are called 4 rabbinical pardes, which is shot literal, and then droshed. There's a deeper meaning within the words, and then Ramaz, allegorical or moral of a story, and then sod, Kabbalistic. And Origen really breaks this down to 3. The literal, apparently, he took Matthew 19:4 very literally. If he actually had himself castrated to teach women, I don't know, but that's disputed. And then there's also the moral teaching. Clearly, Origen was a highly moral being, and apparently doesn't appear to be a hypocrite in any way. He was very noble, and there are moral interpretations to Scripture, which there are obvious moral teachings in the Hebrew Bible, such as the 10 Commandments, and there are allegedly 613 mitzvot, many of which do with the temple, which has been gone for a very long time. And then also in the Christian Testament, there are moral teachings. And then there's a mystical teaching, which I guess the pre-existence of the soul would be one of them, which Origen doesn't fully talk about, but it's clear that he thinks that it's there. So, I mean, hermeneutic deals a lot with the whole idea that we're also reading texts. And even when we read Origen, that's a couple of thousand years old, written in a different language in a different era. And like Rudolf Boltmann, as a modern Christian theologian, points out in books like Jesus and the Word, he talks about demythologizing the New Testament. Let's talk about the kerygma, the preaching. Didn't Jesus have something important to say? And aside from all the theologies, whether he's the only begotten Son of the Father, or whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father or from the Father and the Son, actually the Catholics and the Orthodox got into such a big flap about that they had a battle, the Philoque clause. And like the Buddhists would call it, questions that tend not to edification. So, there is this whole hermeneutic that arose and it rose in among more common people when people like Wycliffe in the 14th century translated the Bible into the vulgar language of English that was developing at that time with Chaucer. And Wycliffe was posthumously excommunicated, and his grave was desecrated for this terrible thing he had done. But the Bible got into English, and actually there were so many words for God in the Hebrew Bible, such as Elohim and Adonai and El Shaddai, that they didn't know what to do with it, so they called it God, which really is, it means unknown in the Anglo-Saxon. And then Martin Luther, whatever you think of Luther, he did have, well, you know what Origen cut off. He did have guts, and he stood up in the church in Wittenberg, and he translated the Bible into the vulgar language of German, which got it out to the masses. And he also expunged the Jewish Apocrypha because the church fathers put it in there, and the Jewish Apocrypha is very interesting. The Anglicans keep it, and so do the Catholics. But yeah, hermeneutic is a really important study, and it's on different levels. And I said, as it goes back to rabbinical tradition as well. So I think that's important when we read any text. And I actually got to like the Bible a lot more once I learned about Gnosticism, and found it very exhilarating to read some of the things Paul says. Whereas at first I thought, oh, this terrible male chauvinist, and then I realized that he greets Phoebe as a diaconus, which is one step below a priest, as a leader of a church in Chinchery, and so that he apparently did not have the opinion about women people thought he did. It's Jerome really disliked women intensely, and Tertullian said that women were all Eves, the seducer of men, and men should stay away from wicked women, and all that. Although it seems that Jesus had many associations with women, such as Mary Magdalene or the woman at the well. So I see there are other questions. I hope I answered your question, Truth.
Yes, that was wonderful. Thank you for
Okay.
touching upon that. Just the
Okay.
allegorical and the various other levels. I appreciate you clarifying and illuminating that.
Okay. Well, we have, I think, Maluka again and Jeffrey again.
I want, you just mentioned about Gnosticism, and I want to know, both Origen and Plotinus were very, very critical of Gnosticism. One of Plotinus's Enneads is entitled "Against the Gnostics,"
Right.
and Origen frequently takes really has strong criticism of what we would now identify as Gnosticism. And like you said, he debated Valentinus. So why do you think this is?
Well, there is an aspect of Gnosticism, the question being about Gnosticism, that's very pessimistic
Mhm.
and negative. It really says that there is a God beyond God, and that Iadabao, the Greek for Yod He Vav He, really created the world and imprisoned the divine human soul in bodies that had to physically duplicate as close as much as they could, and they were compelled into this by sex. So most Gnostics were celibate for that reason. They did not have children, which of course isn't a way to keep a movement going. And there were other Gnostics who were libertine. They're like, let's go experience all kinds of sexuality and crazy things, and then we'll get rid of it. The abomination inspired by Mara, that you can ever go through all these things and then just give it up. So I think Origen probably disliked the pessimism that is in Gnosticism. There are some very uplifting, beautiful ideas, say in the Gospel of Thomas and such. And about half the Gospel of Thomas you also find in the canonical Gospels. So I remember my students used to say that Thomas was a false gospel, and I'd say, what's false about it? About half the sayings in it are also in the canon. But you see, they didn't know that. But I would say it's probably the pessimism and the God beyond God. The whole I think it's in the Valentinian speculation, or that the youngest archon, Sophia, wandering through the pleroma, had a baby by one of the other archons, and then that becomes who ignorantly creates the world and entraps all the pre-existing spirits in it, and that we're all trapped in this terrible, miserable world until we learn to get out of it. So it's a very much opposed to the physical and the body and having children and joy in life. And I suppose, although I mean, it's clear that Jerome was very not well, Jerome as well as Origen. Origen, I'm talking about, was very ascetic. I guess he didn't agree with the pessimism in the Gnostic tradition, which can get pretty heavy in some cases. So I think that's it. And there's probably more to it than that.
Interesting. Because I mean, it was in Egypt, which had a long tradition of monasticism and celibacy. So yeah, it's kind of it's a puzzle to me, So
yeah, the Gnostic manuscripts were buried at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, about 400 miles below Cairo. And my teacher, Dr. Berger Pearson, actually went out there by camel to see where they were taken out of caves. The same sort of story. The little shepherd boy throwing a rock, and there was an earthen jar, and here were all these Gnostic manuscripts, including the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. The Greek version had been known before. But most of these were in Coptic, and unfortunately, one of the Arab women burned some of them, not knowing what they were, until some people who were aware of the extremely important nature of these manuscripts found them. And Professor Giles Gispel, who was a Dutch scholar of religion, was at Harvard when Elaine Pagels got in on the early translation of them, and then she wrote a popular book called The Gnostic Gospels. It happens that I grew up 3 doors from Elaine Pagels. We played together as children.
Oh, really? Whoa.
Yeah, but she did considerably better than I did academically. She went to Stanford and Harvard and Princeton, and I went to San Jose State and UC Santa Barbara and Berkeley and Cal Poly. So she's considered to have done better than I have academically, but I'm glad to read her works.
I don't know. I've heard her lecture in Seattle. She came to a synagogue in Seattle and lectured about the Revelation. And I prefer your lecture any day.
There you go.
Oh, thank you. But Elaine is very brilliant, and I remember her as a child and as a teenager. So I'm very fond of her.
Judy, you are no slacker. So
Well, I didn't get to go to Harvard, but it's all right.
Gosh, thank you very much. I
suffered
think our
enough.
time has run out, and you mentioned Pico della Mirandola. That will be one of the Aquarian series subjects for next year, and also the Gospel according to Thomas. That'll be another one for next year. So we'll be circling back around to all these themes, not only Christian but Buddhist, but Vedanta, Islamic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and deeply philosophical. There are some very metaphysical themes coming up next year as well, including also other teachers like Tsongkhapa and others that are very, very cool. So thank you, Judy, very, very much for your scholarliness and also your theosophical helping us to understand from a theosophical perspective, like all these do. So thanks for putting this together very much.
Thank you. I learned too.
Thank you. It's wonderful to hear you speak on any subject. You weave in so much knowledge as you talk. It'd be nice to hear you just be available, ask Judy anything at the seminar. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah,
I'm not very good at pop culture or mathematics, I'll tell you. Yeah, I could never be on Jeopardy for that reason.
Oh, that's okay. You know your subject. I tell you, it's really cool. Thank you.
Okay.
Next week, we will have the subject of the spiritual sun and the winter solstice. And you are all most cordially invited. Thank you all very much. Thank you,
Thanks,
Judy.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Judy.
Thank you,
everybody.
Judy.
Very good,
Okay,
Judy.
so
Thank you.
glad to see you. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Magnificent.
Oh, well, thanks.
Bye-bye.
I'll work on it. Okay, goodbye.